So if we start considering, like a little bit, right, we have to consider, something else, right? So when we start looking at disparities in use of force, right, more often than not, a lot of these discussions end up getting centered on race and ethnicity. And for whatever reason, most of the conversations tend to be focused on Black Americans, and even though that there is, higher rates of increase of use of force with Black Americans as well as Hispanic Latino Americans, right? Hispanic Latino Americans, for whatever reason, are less discussed. Why? No idea. Some of it is like a measurement issue where, they like officially for years, right? They used to classify Hispanic Latino people as white people when they're like not, right? Because they're also Hispanic Latino, like black people. And so there are, there's a lot of like, issues with like the way that's counted, right? But when we think about most of these disparities, right, how do we, look at the numbers, right? And we see that there is an increase in use of force for Black Americans. We also see that there's an increase, right, for use of force for Hispanic Latino populations. So when you start looking at this, right, there's a lot of questions about, as to like why this might be the case, right? So we'll take a look and remind ourselves of like a reality, right? So we'll start with, if you guys remember, like at the start, I was talking about my hometown. There's this magic line in the city that is, like on the north side and then, on the south side. And so if we were looking at the city, right, if we think about how officers are often patrolled, right, they tend to be are going to be directed to higher crime. And we know from things like social disorganization theory that crime is concentrated in areas, right? So we know that crime is concentrated in small areas. How small are we talking about, right? It's like one of those things that's like 6% of all areas have like 50% of crime. So in this particular case, right, we would find that there is going to be like clusters in certain areas, right? Because that's the way, crime kind of works, right? And while in theory, crime could happen like literally anywhere, right? As if it was random, you know, that's not always the case, right? And so if you think about where calls of service are more likely to happen, right? As a police force, police commander, I'm going to focus on areas where I have greater need. I'm still going to look at these areas, right? But relatively speaking, right, more of my forces are going to, go to the areas with highest crime rates, right? So we know that police are more likely are more present, I suppose, in high crime areas. We also know that these are the areas with increases in physical and social disorder. These are going to be areas where there's more, economic disadvantage. And and because of this, right, there's going to be much more police contact. And so in these situations, right, if we know there's more contact in areas with higher crime, there's more disorder, right, as we discussed about a little bit earlier, right, if you have more contacts, probabilistically, you're going to have this increase in force. And so the other areas that we also know from this, as we discussed earlier in the course, right, is that these areas, because are tend to be in American society, they are more likely to be populated by Black and Hispanic Latino people. So that's one piece of the puzzle, right? So you have like this increase of people in these areas, right? So you're going to have more rates, or like proportionately in the races, right? Where there's going to be, you're going to have a rate comparison difference, right? Now keep in mind, this is not necessarily about raw numbers, right? Is not what we're talking about when we think about disparities, right? The disparity occurs in rates, right? Or relative to like a population share. So when we think about disparities, right, we always have to focus on this aspect, right? Because if we focus on raw counts, we would find that white people receive more use of force, right? But if we consider it from a rate perspective, that's where the disparities come because Black and Hispanic people tend to receive more force relative to the representation in populations, right? So the disparity is related to rates, to rate related to rates over time. So we'll go ahead and pause here.